I've got a new sort of series roughly coming along. It's interesting, and it's different, but it's sort of turning up into... My Saturday morning videos are videos where I'm sort of adding some stuff to the Key Ship series and doing a little bit of extra bits and some interesting points of history when they come. They're either Sunday or Sunday morning videos. And I have one for the G3s and the N3s. It's the Saint class. So there's this idea that the G3s were going to be called the Saint class. Well, no. You see, I've tried to look for the information about it because it's always attracted me as an interesting story, because historically, that'd be kind of rare. The Royal Navy often thought Saint names were rather popish. There's been a St. George as part of the Edgar class, which was only got rid of in 1920, but if we consider the rest of the Saints, they don't really exist. The Royal Navy, they're mostly early 18th century and they're gone. One of them is captured, St. Patrick is captured by the Dutch in about 1737, and the Royal Navy never has it again. So it's an interesting scenario. So with that in mind, I was sitting going, And then I looked at what they're actually attached to. Well, sometimes the Welsh St. David is attached to the N3. And St. George is sometimes attached to the G3. But they aren't attached to the same class together. Okay. Well, St. David and St. David and St. David comes up more often. St. Patrick, not really. And, well, there's the other issue with the St. Patrick. There's the fact that Ireland is doing what Ireland's doing. Ireland's going independent at this point. Naming something St. Patrick would kind of be a bad choice. Politically. So, okay. Well, the idea comes in that people go, well, if they name the saint names, that's going to be this glorious statement to the world. Is it, though? The Royal Navy doesn't name ships after saints. They haven't. So, what could they be going to name them? What would they be naming them if they're not? If they're not naming them St. Andrew, if they're not naming them St. Patrick, if they're not naming them St. George and St. David, what could be naming them? Because the St. David, as I said, is linked more to the battleships than it is to the Gs, and St. George is sometimes linked to the G3s. But sometimes. Well, you look at where these sort of saint names come in. They're coming in as a suggestion of Guides, who is, of course, famed for the Guides axe. Yes, he's the Lord of the Admiralty at the time. And after someone who's wielded such an axe and has gets rid of so many people and has such a glowing relationship with the Royal Navy, though some of that's to come later, his suggestions as First Lord of the Admiralty are really going to have a lot of weight with the naming committee. They are. You must remember, the naming committee is often made up of naval officers who are not exactly going to usually be staying in the service. They're usually ones who are, that's their posting before they retire. It's a nice posting to have before you retire, at this period. So they're not worried about preserving their post or anything, or keeping the favour of the minister. So then what names could they be? Well, let's consider. We know where Rodney comes from, the Nelson class, because they had the papers ready because of HMS Rodney, which was going to be one of the Admiral class. And then, of course, Anson and Howe come back in the King George V class. Okay? So there are Admiral names going around. The name which appears interesting is Nelson, because there's an HMS Lord Nelson. It's a pre-dreadnought. The last pre-dreadnought class. But Nelson, that's a different name. That's a different badge. That's a different... Lots of differences come in. And yet, that pack is described as being ready to go when they select Nelson and Rodney. And then let's think about this from the Royal Navy's perspective of global reach. This is one of the reasons why people sometimes point on saint names and go, ah, yes, but people latch onto them because, you know, they'll be understood around the world. Maybe, maybe not, but let's be honest, if you have a choice, and I think I've written this in a comment, and I'm re-recording this video. This is the second draft of this video because I've made some comments in a discussion which, broadly speaking, I found interesting. I have to admit, as a comment on one, and it made me think more about this, and turned it from a 5-minute video into possibly a 10-minute video. But the thing is, what's the Royal Navy trying to do? They picked admiral names, the admiral class, for a reason. Continuing on with that theme would seem sensible, because the admirals are the version of the Royal Navy's saints. The admirals are the Royal Navy's presence around the world. HMS Nelson is far scarier than HMS St. George, because whilst one in theory has slayed a dragon, in practice, as far as the Royal Navy's PR around the world has been going on for many years, one actually slayed a dragon, i.e. Nelson slayed Napoleon. We've been over the truth on this channel, you don't need to get into that. But the point is, which is scarier? You have to get into the names of ships, and sometimes there are reasoning going on for that. But I've often had queries in my mind over the saint and nomenclature for the G3s, mainly because, as I think I mentioned earlier, the RN's dislike of popery. They are very, very Edwardian to popery. And this is something which is even stronger in the Royal Navy of the 1920s. They are very, very worried about looking popish. And I don't mean that popish in an anti-Catholic way. This is the other interesting thing. They mean popish in terms of a French or Spanish way, because they don't want their ships to sound like French or Spanish ships, which is why they don't like saint names. That's one of the reasons why they eschew them. They capture ships which have saint names. They don't build ships which have saint names. St. George has had a history, but St. George was the patron saint of England and slayed a dragon. It's nice imagery to pick up. The others, slightly more complicated. And this is another reason why the Royal Navy, when other people were going more and more on their ecclesiastical routes in a naval naming, decided to go down the Greek mythology route. Again, another option of names. It could have been gone the Greek mythology route. Never doubt that as a potential option for the Royal Navy, but they do like these things. But still, that's unlikely. So I would love to see if you have other primary sources you can point to and other information you can point to for their naming. Because I've had it mentioned in books, but the only primary source information I've ever found wasn't actually in an Admiralty archive document about it, or discussion that, not an archive one. It was in a personal note talking about a discussion with Geats. And you can weigh on that what you will, because the person who was having the discussion with him wasn't a naval officer. The person was another politician. So it was two politicians having a chat about what Geats would maybe like to name ships. That to me, if that's the source people are going from, doesn't have much weight. But these things take on a turn, because I could understand a historian has read that, talks about it. And then another historian quotes that in a book, and they made me change the language around, because that's what historians do. And another one quotes it, another one quotes it, and slowly you go from having a minor point to being, this is almost a tenet of faith. And I've gone through the various books and tried to track it down back as far as I can. And the earliest claim I've got discussing about them being called saint ships is from a book in the 1960s. Which, theoretically, they know what they're talking about, because, they should have first-hand connection with the people involved. But there again, if you think about that, that's 40 years. That's enough time for a half-point discussion to become a full-blown, story in its constant retelling. Now, the other interesting thing people point to is other ships and naming at the time, and everyone has their own reasons for what they're naming them for. If we consider Japan, they tend to put out names which are based on their mythology. It's very important to the domestic, political, cultural efforts that they choose the names they do. The US Navy is building itself. So it's looking for names which give it a heritage, a history. If you look at especially the choosing of names, when you're choosing battleships, they have to pick state names because of their status. But when they're dealing with cruisers, they can be slightly more selective. And the Lexingtons are proof of this because they can go for the original 6 frigates, which is their heritage. It is their history. This is going to be their reaching out to the world, their new birth. Because, of course, the 6 frigates, when they built, were supposed to be the birth of the US Navy, and as we all know, they then got into quite big issues quite immediately and had all sorts of false starts. So these battle cruisers, these ships, were going to be their new birth. In contrast, he says, the Royal Navy is not about that. The Royal Navy is about presenting the world with their presence, with their emphasis at this point, and also showing off their history. They don't have to generate history, they have history to use. Saint names don't give them any history. Saint names don't give them anything when it comes to reaching out the world. Admirals' names do. For the very reason we do not use admirals' names today for ships, Admiral Duncan is probably the only example. Using admirals' names in those days for ships was a good thing. Because it reminded everyone, yes, this ship is named for the person who beat you up several times. So yes, it's not just a ship turning up, but it's a history of victory. And for that, I'm reminded of this text, which I'm going to look at about, The Habit of Victory, Story of the Royal Navy from 1545 to 1945 by Peter Hall. And that's the thing. That's what the Royal Navy's trying to project. It's trying to start, especially with ships which are going to be its image around the world, or going around the world, it's trying to project the fact of, we have won, we always win, historically we always win, so don't fight us, because you'll lose. Because remember what's happened last time. It's about psyching your enemy out before you even fight them. So this is why, if you can present me with primary source information, that is an Admiralty Archives document, that is an actual article by someone from the Naming Committee or anything like that, which shows they were considering saint names, I will quite happily agree with you and concede. But I haven't been able to find any of that myself. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, I'm saying I haven't found it. I've looked, but I haven't. All I've found so far is that little point to Geeds, or written point ascribed to Geeds by another politician, which a very nice archivist showed me, because I was talking about them, I was in there researching something else, and I mentioned I was always interested in those, and went, well, we have this in this section, which is written by so-and-so, who was an MP at the time, and they're writing down their notes from Geeds, and oh. And even then, Geeds doesn't say Saint class, he talks about using St. George and St. David for the class of ships coming up. He doesn't mention St. Patrick. He doesn't mention St. Andrew. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and as said, I'd love to hear where, if there is any information anywhere. Thank you very much, and take care. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you enjoyed this sort of series coming up.